The Battle of Kursk stands as the largest tank engagement in human history, and the moment when the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently into Soviet hands. By the spring of 1943, the German Wehrmacht had suffered a catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. But a brilliant counter-offensive by Erich von Manstein at Kharkov had stabilized the line, creating a massive bulge in the front, known as the Kursk salient. This westward-pointing protrusion was 150 miles wide and 100 miles deep, offering the German High Command a tempting target for a classic pincer movement. Adolf Hitler and his generals conceived Operation Citadel, a plan to strike from the north and south to trap and destroy the Soviet armies within the bulge. However, the German leadership was divided. While some urged an immediate strike, Hitler insisted on delaying the offensive to wait for the arrival of new Panther and Tiger tanks, as well as the heavy Ferdinand tank destroyers. This delay proved to be a fatal miscalculation. While the Germans gathered their steel, the Soviet Stavka, led by Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, was fully aware of the German intentions thanks to the Lucy spy ring and British Enigma intercepts. Instead of launching a preemptive strike, the Soviets chose a strategy of deep defense, turning the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified zone in the history of warfare. They constructed 8 successive defensive lines consisting of thousands of miles of trenches, massive minefields with densities of over 3,000 mines per mile, and sophisticated anti-tank strongpoints known as pack fronts. By the time the Germans were ready to move on July 5, 1943, they were no longer attacking a vulnerable pocket, but a literal fortress. By the time the Germans were ready to move on July 5, 1943, they were no longer attacking a vulnerable pocket, but a literal fortress. In the north, General Walter Model's 9th Army faced such dense defenses that they managed to penetrate only 8 miles in a week of brutal fighting, eventually grinding to a halt against the heights of Olkovatka. In the south, the 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth made better progress, utilizing the superior range of their Tiger tanks to pick off Soviet T-34s from a distance. The fighting was characterized by an unprecedented level of violence and mechanical carnage, with the air filled with the smoke of burning diesel and the screams of twisted metal. The climax of the southern pincer occurred on July the 12th near the railway junction of Prokhorovka. In a dusty, claustrophobic landscape, hundreds of German and Soviet tanks charged at one another in a chaotic melee. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by Pavel Rotmistrov, launched a literal suicide charge to close the distance and negate the German range advantage, leading to point-blank engagements where tanks rammed each other and crews fought with pistols and grenades after their vehicles were disabled. While the tactical outcome of Prokhorovka remains a subject of historical debate, its strategic impact was clear. The German offensive had spent its last reserves of strength. On the same day, the Soviets launched Operation Kutuzov against the German rear in the north, and Hitler, unnerved by the Allied invasion of Sicily and the failure to achieve a breakthrough, ordered Operation Citadel to be cancelled. The Germans had lost the ability to replace their losses, while the Soviet industrial machine was just reaching its peak. Following the defensive phase, the Red Army transitioned into a massive counter-offensive, Operation Rumyantsev, which liberated Belgorod and Kharkov. The Battle of Kursk was not just a clash of armor, it was the death knell of the Blitzkrieg. After August 1943, the German army was forced into a continuous, agonizing retreat toward the borders of the Reich. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered in the wheat fields of Russia, and the road to Berlin was now open, paved with the scorched hulls of the Panzerwaffe. To understand the sheer scale of this confrontation, one must look beyond the tanks and into the logistical nightmare that preceded the first shot. The German delay from May to July allowed the Soviets to mobilize over 300,000 civilians to dig the very trenches that would swallow the Panzerwaffe whole. Every village within the salient became a fortress, every tree line a hidden nest for the dreaded 76mm anti-tank guns. The Soviet Air Force, the VVS, also underwent a massive reorganization, challenging the Luftwaffe for air superiority for the first time in the war. On the German side, the technical teething problems of the Panther tank were disastrous. Many broke down before even reaching the front lines, their engines catching fire under the strain of the Russian summer heat. The Ferdinand tank destroyers, while possessing impenetrable armor, lacked machine guns for close-in defense, leaving them vulnerable to Soviet infantry, who would crawl up to the massive machines and disable them with magnetic mines or Molotov cocktails. The human cost was equally staggering, with millions of men locked in a struggle that felt more like the static attrition of World War I than the fast-moving maneuvers of 1941. In the northern sector, the fighting at Ponyri Station became known as the Stalingrad of Kursk, where railway embankments and water towers changed hands dozens of times in a single day. The ground was so saturated with metal that compasses became useless, and the stench of decay was inescapable. In the south, the SS Panzer Corps, including the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, represented the absolute elite of the German military, yet even they found themselves bled white by the endless layers of Soviet resistance. When the Soviet counter-offensives, Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, finally broke the German lines, it signaled a shift in the very nature of the war. The Red Army had proven it could not only survive a German summer offensive, but could absorb the blow and strike back with even greater force. Loss of Kharkov for the final time was a symbolic and strategic blow from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. The industrial disparity became the deciding factor, as Soviet factories in the Urals churned out thousands of T-34s to replace those lost at Prokhorovka, while German production struggled under the weight of Allied strategic bombing. By the end of August, the German army was a hollowed-out force, its best divisions decimated and its morale beginning to fracture. The Battle of Kursk proved that the German quality over quantity philosophy could not overcome the Soviet deep battle doctrine when executed with such ruthless efficiency. It was the moment the world realized that the Third Reich was no longer fighting for victory, but merely for time. The legacy of Kursk remains etched in the landscape of the Russian steppe, where the rusted remains of tanks are still occasionally unearthed, silent witnesses to the greatest clash of steel the world has ever seen. This was the turning point where the tide of the war didn't just stop, it surged backward with an unstoppable momentum that would eventually carry the Red Army all the way to the steps of the Reichstag. The strategic genius of Zhukov, the resilience of the Soviet soldier, and the catastrophic hubris of the German leadership all converged in this one massive salient to decide the fate of Europe. As the dust settled over the charred remains of the Tiger and Panther tanks, the reality of the situation became clear to both sides. The initiative was gone, the reserves were spent, and the long, bloody road to the end of the war had truly begun. There would be no more major German offensives in the east, only a desperate, fighting withdrawal against an enemy that had finally mastered the art of modern mechanized warfare on a continental scale.